They said it was just a crash-twisted metal, burned earth, and a body not meant for this planet. But when the Pentagon opened it up, what they found inside wasn't just biology, it was a message. The rain tapped softly on the Pentagon's slate roof, a rhythm slow and deliberate, like a lullaby, hummed by something ancient and watchful. Outside, the streets were empty. Inside, beneath a building that never slept, a light flickered to life behind a rusting steel door that most personnel didn't know existed. The air was heavy down there, not just with dust, but with the weight of secrets, old, forgotten, and waiting. A lone figure in a gray uniform descended the stairwell without a flashlight, guided only by the faint green glow leaking under the vault door below. Each step creaked, as if the building itself resisted the approach. At the bottom, he paused, inserted a brass key into a lock that hadn't turned in decades, and pushed the door open. Cold air spilled out like a whisper. Inside, the walls were lined with cabinets sealed with wax and string, each stamped with numbers no department claimed. At the far end of the room stood a real projector, covered in canvas, still plugged in, and beside it, a case marked not with an official file number, but with a single phrase in handwritten ink, Project Blue Harvest. No date, no author. Just a warning label etched into the film canister for eyes no longer human. He hesitated. Then he removed the canister, brushed the dust from its lid, and loaded the reel into the projector. The machine shuddered awake with a mechanical sigh, casting warped frames onto the wall. Black and white images sputtered across the screen first, a desert storm, then static, then the inside of a room with too many shadows. The film had no sound, but the silence was louder than any scream. Flickering across the wall, shapes moved under surgical lights, bodies that did not breathe, did not bleed, did not belong. Men in surgical masks worked in perfect synchronization, not speaking, only nodding as they removed something from inside a rib cage that didn't look like it had ever known a heartbeat. The eyes of the thing on the table were open, and though it did not blink, something behind those lenses shimmered. Watching, remembering. The reel ended. The room dimmed. But the green glow behind the file cabinets only grew stronger. The man did not leave. Not yet. He walked toward it, drawn, perhaps lulled, by something just out of sight. Behind the final cabinet, a second reel waited larger, unlabeled. A quiet hum began to fill the room. And somewhere, deep beneath the Pentagon, the night turned darker still. They brought the body in under tarpaulin and moonlight, its form barely visible beneath folds of soaked canvas and nervous hands. The air at Roswell Army Airfield that night was thick with dust and secrecy, the kind that clung to your clothes and your conscience. No one spoke above a whisper, not the officers, not the scientists flown in from distant bases. Even the truck's engine, which had roared across the desert for hours, now idled with the hush of a funeral procession. The crash site, cordoned off before dawn, was already scrubbed clean by the time most people knew something had fallen from the sky. Witnesses were discredited, frightened, or vanished entirely. But the body was real. They laid it on a reinforced metal table beneath harsh surgical lights, and the silence that followed was not one of awe, but confusion. It looked humanoid, but only just. Slender limbs, too many joints, a torso that tapered like it had been drawn from memory, not born, and a head that was too large, too smooth, pale, but not from decay. The skin had no pigment, no pores, no hair. When touched, it offered no resistance, only a strange, spongy collapse, like memory foam that forgot too quickly. They tried cutting it, not out of cruelty, but protocol. The scalpel didn't slice so much as dissolve the outer layer like the skin gave up its integrity on contact. No blood emerged, just a faint, shimmering fluid that clung to gloves like oil, but evaporated before containment. A forensic pathologist whispered that the fluid was thinking, and then laughed at himself too long, too loud, before being escorted out. Inside, there were bones, but the X-rays showed something else: no marrow, no spongy internal framework, just empty, hollow scaffolding. Light passed through some of the bones entirely. They weren't built for gravity, someone said. They weren't built for here. The lungs, if they were lungs, were soft sacs filled with granular crystals. The heart, or where one might expect a heart, was a coiled lattice of tissue unlike anything in terrestrial biology. No valves, no chambers. But it pulsed, once, when touched. Every man in the room stepped back in unison, like prey realizing the predator still had breath. And then the eyes, they didn't blink. Even in death, they stared. Too large, too wet, like they had been underwater for a long, long time. Some said they reflected images not present in the room. A technician swore he saw his childhood home in their surface. Another collapsed when the eyes locked on him, mumbling about stars that were wrong and skies that never ended. A security officer watching from the corner eventually draped a cloth over the face, not from protocol. From unease. The notes were sparse, the photos underexposed, and the report was buried under layers of bureaucracy. But one page survived, scanned, archived. It bore no heading. Only this line, written in trembling ink: not dead, not alive. Not from here. And beside it, the date, July the 8th, 1947, Roswell. The autopsy room in Building 14 had no windows, no clocks, and no name on the door. The fluorescent lights buzzed like insects in a jar, but even they could not disguise the strange stillness that began the moment you entered. Those who worked the room claimed time lost its grip in there. Minutes stretched, hours folded. Entire nights passed unnoticed, until the sun outside reappeared and reminded them that the world had kept moving, even if they hadn't. Watches refused to tick past a certain point. A young lieutenant removed his Rolex after watching the second hand skip forward, then backward, then vanish altogether. Pocket watches melted internally, not from heat, but from something deeper, like their gears had lost the will to turn. Wall clocks stopped, restarted, then spun in dizzying circles before falling silent. They replaced them, again and again. Eventually, they stopped trying. Film reels, those spools of precious evidence, would play normally for the first few seconds, then repeat frames out of order, sometimes in reverse. One reel captured a surgeon leaning over a specimen, cutting into its chest. The footage then jumped to him standing at the opposite side of the table, hands folded, mouth moving in slow speech. In the next loop, he was gone entirely, replaced by a shadow that did not match any present in the room. When technicians tried to rewind the film, they found it blank. But when left idle, the projector would start again on its own, showing frames no one remembered shooting. Surgeons began reporting symptoms no medical textbook could explain: nosebleeds, pressure behind the eyes. One described hearing a low, musical humming, as if the walls were breathing in rhythm. Another claimed he smelled something like ozone mixed with rotting oranges, a smell that came only when the scalpel touched nerve tissue. He would later be committed, after waking from a sleepwalking episode with medical diagrams carved into his arms. Hallucinations were common. One night, Dr. Elkin, head of pathology, halted an autopsy mid-incision and began whispering in a language no one recognized. His assistant, alarmed, tried to intervene. Elkin turned to him and asked, calmly, why there were 3 of the same body on the table, each in different stages of decay. There was only one. Others heard voices, but not in the air inside their own minds, not commands, just fragments, words like remember or return. One nurse fainted after glancing into a tray of extracted tissue and seeing her mother's face reflected in the glistening mess. Her mother had been dead for 12 years. Eventually, they removed all timekeeping devices from the room. Watches were forbidden. Phones were left outside. Even conversations about the passage of time were discouraged. One officer wrote in his log, "If you talk about it, it notices." The Pentagon labeled it a localized electromagnetic anomaly, harmless, contained, but staff rotations increased, and no one worked alone anymore. Doors were kept propped open, and the overhead cameras, though rarely functioning, remained aimed squarely at the table. And somewhere deep in the files, buried behind classification codes and redacted names, a single line was scribbled in pencil. It read, "Time doesn't stop. It listens." They had never seen anything like it. The outer layer of the being was cool to the touch, not cold like a cadaver, but softly indifferent, like the surface of untouched river stones. The color shifted under the lights, not with pigment but with depth, as if there were layers just below the surface that moved when no one was looking. One technician described it as liquid marble. Another refused to touch it at all. When the first incision was made, the scalpel met almost no resistance. It sank in with an ease that unsettled everyone in the room, the way a hand might sink into warm clay. But what followed was stranger still. Instead of splitting open, the skin collapsed around the blade. Not torn, not sliced, just folded inward, absorbing the shape like it had been waiting for that exact pressure. And then, seconds later, it began to rise. The depression vanished. The skin puffed back into place, not scarred, not damaged, but whole, as if it remembered its original form and chose to return to it. The surgeon tested this again, cutting deeper. Again, the skin gave way, swallowed the blade, and then healed, not repaired. Healed, no clotting, no tissue rupture, only the faintest shimmer, like heat haze on a desert road. They took samples, but the results made no sense. Under the microscope, the cells didn't behave like cells. They weren't fixed structures. They morphed and flexed, mimicking the tools around them, sometimes even forming shapes that looked eerily like fingertips, as if they had touched too much and begun to imitate. One researcher left a biopsy sample in a sealed petri dish overnight. By morning, the glass was empty. No residue, no stain. Just a small thumbprint on the inside lid, though no one admitted to opening it. The skin reacted differently to different people. One assistant with a heart condition reported a faint pressure in his chest when near the body. Another, recently pregnant, claimed the skin pulsed in time with her heartbeat. Tests confirmed nothing, but the room began to feel smaller, more watchful. They tried freezing it. Nothing changed. They tried heat. Still nothing. Radiation caused it to shimmer, but never burn. Electricity made it contract, but only momentarily. It was as if the skin recognized threats and chose how to respond, not instinctively. Intelligently, the Pentagon referred to it as responsive tissue with exceptional memory retention, but among the team it gained another name. They called it the shroud, because no matter how many times they cut, it always returned, always covered, always concealed. One night, when the room was empty, the backup cameras caught a strange occurrence. The body, long since inactive, shifted, only slightly, only once. But the skin along its arm, under the overhead light, rippled. Not from wind, not from pressure, like something beneath it was stretching, yawning, remembering how to wear its shape again. When they opened the body further, they expected the usual signs of trauma, hemorrhaging, bruising, pools of blood settling in the lower tissues. But there was none. Not a single drop. The cavity was dry clean, even. Not sterile, but strangely preserved, as if the body had never known blood, or never needed it. Instead, nestled between the organs, or what passed for organs, was a clear, gelatinous substance, thick, but not sticky. It clung to the gloves of the surgeon like sap, yet when shaken, it slipped off in slow ribbons and retreated into itself, forming perfect little domes on the metal tray. It had no color, but it shimmered faintly under the lights. Not from moisture, from something else, something alive. At first, they assumed it was some kind of internal lubricant. Perhaps this species had evolved without blood, using a synthetic gel for nutrient transport or temperature regulation. But the gel didn't behave like a passive fluid. When exposed to air, it began to move not fast, not violently, but with a purposeful undulation. It twisted, contracted, and shifted its shape as if reacting to presence, not to heat or pressure, but to attention. One technician leaned in too closely while observing it. The gel rose ever so slightly toward his face, then dropped flat when he blinked. Later, the same technician reported vivid dreams of drowning in clear water while stars passed overhead in unnatural patterns. He requested reassignment the next day and never spoke of it again. When stored in sealed containers, the gel remained inert. But when left uncovered, it began to pulse faintly, almost like breath. Samples kept under vacuum began to expand, pressing against their glass enclosures as if they were trying to push through. At one point, a droplet escaped containment and slid across the steel countertop against gravity. It climbed upward for over 6 inches before finally collapsing into a pool again. The movement was silent but unmistakable. Tests revealed nothing consistent. The gel did not freeze, did not boil, and resisted all known solvents. Under ultraviolet light, it split into a lattice of geometric lines, circles, spirals, and interlocking hexagons like the blueprints of a forgotten language. One biochemist theorized it was a form of suspended intelligence, not a circulatory fluid, but an information medium, something that carried not oxygen, but memory. Another theory, written hastily in a notebook that was later seized and classified, claimed the gel was a traveler itself, that what they were dissecting was merely a vessel, a suit, and the true entity had been the shimmering substance now slowly decaying in Pentagon refrigeration units, still trying to remember where it came from. They called it lifeless. But the footage told another story. In one clip, slowed to a fraction of its original speed, a single droplet of the gel lifted slightly just as a man entered the room. It didn't reach for him. It didn't threaten. It simply turned, not toward the body, toward the camera. It happened during what should have been a routine tissue collection. The team had moved on from the thoracic cavity and was documenting appendage structure: arms, hands, digits. The fingers, 5 on each hand, appeared almost human at a glance. Same general shape, same familiar geometry. But the resemblance was only skin deep. Dr. Marlowe was the one holding the scalpel. He had been methodical all night, hands steady, voice calm, even when faced with anatomy no textbook could explain. But this time, his hand slipped not from error, but from texture. The skin along the fingertip was too smooth, too pliant, and the blade drifted off course. A shallow cut opened at the tip of the being's index finger. What followed silenced the room. There was no blood, no tissue, no exposed nerve. Instead, something slid forward from the cut, delicate at first, like a single silver thread unraveling from beneath the skin. But it did not fall. It reached. More threads followed, interwoven, fibrous, and impossibly thin. They shimmered with a metallic sheen, coiling and branching like the roots of a tree growing in fast motion. They did not lash out. They did not attack. They simply unfurled. And then, sensing movement perhaps, they recoiled, snapping back into the fingertip as fast as they had emerged, the incision sealing behind them with no trace of injury. The room remained still for a long moment. Someone whispered that it looked like wire. Another said it looked like nerve endings made of glass. But it wasn't either. Dr. Marlowe dropped the scalpel. They sedated the air. A gas was released, intended to neutralize biological contaminants. But the next time they examined the fingertip, the mesh had changed. It no longer responded to pressure or light. It had gone dormant, or perhaps withdrawn entirely. Further attempts to replicate the emergence failed. Only one photograph had been taken during the incident, a blurred, half-lit frame showing the threads mid-extension. Analysis revealed symmetrical filaments branching in a fractal pattern, each one barbed like a hook, yet curved inward, almost as if designed to hold, not harm, not a weapon. A tool. One theory suggested the mesh was sensory in nature, capable of extracting environmental data on a molecular level. Another posited it was a kind of interface, something designed to connect with technology, perhaps even consciousness. But the question that lingered longest was simpler. Why had it responded at all? The being had been lifeless for weeks, no signs of neural activity, no biological impulse. Yet something inside that fingertip had known when it was touched, known when it was cut, and chosen deliberately to show itself. The official report described it as subdermal structural anomaly, filamentous, non-terrestrial, possibly synthetic organic hybrid. But behind closed doors, the team called it something else, the trap, because they had not discovered it. It had revealed itself, briefly, and then waited. They removed the cranium with care, each layer of bone lifting away like the petals of something long fossilized. What lay beneath defied not only expectation, but biology itself. The brain was not pink, not gray, not even solid. It was transparent, crystal clear like polished quartz, yet soft to the touch like gelatin suspended in glass. No folds, no veins. Just a perfect, gleaming mass suspended inside a skull that seemed built to protect it more like a jewel than an organ. The lead neurologist, Dr. Renner, leaned in with a penlight. He didn't speak, just clicked it on and held it to the side of the brain, angling the beam through the surface. What followed unraveled what little certainty they had left. Images moved inside, not reflections, not illusions. Actual, moving pictures, as if the tissue were a living film reel. At first, they appeared abstract flashes of stars, comets, vast voids of space curling inward like oceans of smoke. Then, more distinct shapes began to form. Planets, rings of fire, cloud systems spiraling across alien worlds. Gasps echoed through the room. The light moved slightly, and new images appeared, tall structures of impossible architecture standing on cliffs that seemed to hover above black seas, metallic cities without windows, machines orbiting twin suns. Then came something worse, something familiar. War. Explosions bloomed in silence. Fire engulfed a forest of spires. Ships, unlike anything known to Earth, collided in the cold vacuum above a crimson planet. Beings, some not unlike the one lying open on the table, rushed across battlefields under skies that bled. The slideshow never paused. It didn't loop. Every new angle revealed new memories, as if the brain held not thoughts, but time itself. Generations of sights, stored not symbolically, but visually. Not remembered, recorded. One researcher brought in a polarized lens. When held to the surface of the brain, the images slowed, then reversed. They watched as a sun reassembled itself from particles, as beings rose from ash, as cities unburned, rewinding lives, erasing death. Dr. Renner suggested a hypothesis, whispered, not written, that this brain was not merely a processing organ, but a storage device, that its function was to carry history, not personal memories, civilizational ones. Others disagreed. They believed it was a map, not of where the being had been, but of what it had seen. That it might be part of a relay, each individual carrying the last's visual legacy across space and time, eyes as cameras, brains as projectors. Later that night, a janitor not cleared for any level of classified access wandered too close to the table. He looked into the brain's core under dimmed lights. Just a glance. He was found seated in the hallway hours later, whispering coordinates that matched no location on Earth. He had never studied astronomy, but he repeated the numbers with calm certainty. One of the assistants, quiet, skeptical, scientific to a fault, left a note in her locker the following morning. It said, "The brain showed me my own birth. I was alone in the womb. But the light showed another heartbeat beside mine, one that never made it. And yet, it knew." The Pentagon filed the object as Specimen 17. The report labeled it photoreceptive neuromass with non-terrestrial encoding. But unofficially, those who saw it used a different word entirely: archive. The eyes were the last to be touched. Even among the team of hardened specialists, pathologists, biologists, military observers, there was a hesitation when it came to the face. The body had been opened, studied, logged. But those eyes had remained untouched, as if even in death, they retained a sovereignty no scalpel dared violate. They were large, proportionally unnatural, and clear as glass, yet held depth, endless depth, like the surface of still water hiding something ancient below. At first glance, they resembled crystal. But under magnification, it became clear they were multifaceted like an insect's compound lens, except more intricate, with an impossible number of tiny surfaces. Light passed through them, not in straight beams, but fractured and multiplied, as if each eye saw the world not once, but thousands of times over, not as it was, but as it might be, or had been. When the lead surgeon finally reached in with a pair of forceps to extract the left eye, the temperature in the room reportedly dropped by several degrees. Instruments began to flicker. Static hissed over the intercom. The moment the eye broke free from its socket, 3 people collapsed, not from injury, from seizures. The first was a technician monitoring heart rate data. She slumped forward, eyes wide open, whispering something under her breath in a language no one could recognize. Her hands gripped the edge of the table as if holding on to the world. The second was a guard posted at the door. He began shouting coordinates, numbers, and symbols until he bit through his own tongue and fell unconscious. The third was Dr. Renner, who, moments before blacking out, calmly removed his gloves and said, "It's not dead. It's dreaming." The eye was placed in a containment unit, but even there, it shimmered faintly, changing color depending on who was near. Some saw red, others blue. One assistant claimed it turned completely black when she approached, reflecting her face in perfect detail. Except she was smiling in the reflection, and she wasn't smiling in the room. Those who recovered from the seizures described vivid hallucinations, though none aligned. One reported standing at the edge of a vast canyon where stars poured upward like smoke. Another described being submerged beneath a silver ocean, surrounded by beings with eyes like hers. The guard who had spoken coordinates later confessed he had seen himself older, bearded, speaking into a radio while something burned behind him. None of it made sense, but all of it felt real. Further study revealed the crystalline structure of the eyes could not be mapped. Light didn't just pass through them, it slowed, bent, folded in on itself. Theories emerged, wild, fringe ideas that the eyes were not passive organs, but active receivers, that they were not just for seeing, but for being seen through. That perhaps something, somewhere, was watching back. Eventually, the Pentagon ordered both eyes encased in lead-lined containment, access restricted, analysis halted, too many incidents, too many minds lost in images that weren't theirs. But before the last seal was placed, a lab assistant, young, untrained, and curious, looked into the eye one final time. She said she saw herself, but older, standing in a room that didn't exist yet, watching someone else dissect something that looked almost human except for the eyes. When they opened the throat, they expected the usual scaffolding of voice, the windpipe, the larynx, the soft architecture of a mouth made for sound. But inside this being, there were no lungs, no vocal folds, no tongue to shape syllables, no epiglottis to direct breath. There was nothing that should have allowed speech. And yet, every recovered tape from the Roswell perimeter reported a sound. Not from the ship, from something inside it. At first, the team thought the vocal cavity was empty, smooth and polished, almost like glass that had never known use. But then one of the surgeons noticed a shimmer. 2 fine threads, silver and hair-thin, stretched from the base of the spine all the way up through the hollow of the throat, disappearing just beneath the jawline. They were perfectly parallel, vibrating slightly, though there was no current, no pulse, no airflow. They moved on their own, not like wires, like antennae. Attempts to remove them failed. The moment metal touched metal, the room would fill with static, not from machines but from nowhere, a high-pitched whine, just on the edge of hearing, that seemed to grow louder the longer you listened. The noise didn't record, it couldn't be measured, but everyone heard it, and some swore they heard more than that. Words, not clear ones, not earthly ones, but shapes in the noise, patterns, something that almost formed language, like the whisper of a dream just before waking. They called it the etherphone. The term began as a joke, an offhand comment during a late-night session by one of the audio engineers, but it stuck. Because the closer they studied the silver chords, the more they realized they weren't mechanical. Not exactly. They carried signal, yes, but not like copper or fiber. These threads responded. They changed pitch based on who was in the room. When a man with a prosthetic leg entered, they went silent. When a pregnant researcher leaned near, they hummed like a tuning fork. One experiment involved playing frequencies into the throat cavity, low-range pulses, then high-range, then harmonic oscillations. When the team played a specific sequence, 3 tones repeated twice, the filaments twisted, just slightly, and something emerged from the speaker. Not feedback, not an echo, a voice, grainy, cracked, but unmistakably formed. A single phrase, repeated once and never again. You are not first. That was the moment everything changed. The reports shifted from biological study to containment protocol. The room was sealed. Clearance was restricted, and the filaments were left untouched from that point forward. One final recording existed buried, erased from all official logs. It was taken on the last day the etherphone was active. A junior staff member, staying late, had turned on the overhead mic without authorization. The filaments were motionless, silent, until he whispered a question into the air. He asked, "What do you want from us?" There was a pause, and then a sound, 2 syllables, not angry, not mechanical, almost gentle, to remember. The next morning, the filaments had turned black, brittle, and fell apart on contact. But even in death, they left behind an echo, one that some claim you can still hear if you listen to the static just before sleep. They assumed it was a stomach at first. The cavity sat where one should have, nestled beneath a cluster of unfamiliar organs, suspended in a web of translucent ligaments. But it didn't digest. It didn't pulse or churn. It simply resonated. When the first scalpel touched the surface, the table trembled not from the cut, but from the sound. A low hum, so subtle it was felt more than heard, rippled through the floor tiles and into the soles of their boots. The chamber was smooth inside, lined with a pearlescent film that reflected light like wet silk. Embedded along the inner wall were clusters of crystalline material quartz. It seemed, but not naturally formed. These crystals were shaped with precision, carved, arranged. One intern said it looked like a harp made of glass and tissue. They ran a tuning fork test, placing different frequencies near the cavity. At certain pitches, the chamber would respond, almost like a wine glass catching a song. The soft tissue vibrated, the crystals began to hum, and then, without warning, it spoke, not a screech, not distortion, a voice, human, female, and familiar. It said, "You left me. The voice belonged to Dr. Renner's late wife. She had died 3 years earlier in a car crash just outside Barstow. There was no record of her voice being played in that room, no audio input of any kind, but the organ had said it, in her tone, in her cadence, with the exact sorrow that had haunted his dreams since the funeral. Testing intensified. They played white noise, and the organ answered in fragments. Sentences that didn't match, but carried weight. One researcher heard a childhood lullaby. Another heard her brother's laugh, the brother who had vanished in the Bermuda Triangle in 1976. Each voice was accurate, precise, uncanny. The Pentagon called it the echo organ. Theory after theory attempted to explain it. Some said it recorded sound across time, like a biological phonograph storing echoes of emotional resonance. Others said it pulled memories from those nearby and reshaped them into sound. A darker hypothesis emerged quietly in the margins of one report, that it was not mimicking voices at all, but relaying them. That the voices did not come from the organ, but through it, as if the chamber was a doorway, a conduit, a throat for something that had no form of its own, but borrowed yours to speak. They tried removing it. The moment the surrounding ligaments were cut, the temperature in the lab dropped 14 degrees. Lights blew out one by one, and the lead surgeon collapsed, clutching his head, repeating a single word over and over. Remember. Eventually, the chamber was sealed in a lead-lined crate and stored beneath the deepest sublevel of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. But the sounds didn't stop. Guards reported whispers, sometimes laughter, sometimes weeping, always familiar, always specific. One man heard his mother singing a hymn she'd only ever sung once on the night he turned 5. Another heard himself, screaming. To this day, no one knows what triggers the voices. But the last person assigned to monitor it, a linguist who had worked on signal decryption for over a decade, left only a single note before he disappeared. It read, "The organ doesn't echo sound. It echoes loss." When they reached the chest cavity, there was no sternum to cut, just a single plate of bone-like material fused into a perfect convex curve. It shimmered faintly, like the inside of a seashell, and resisted every surgical tool they tried. Only a heated diamond blade, applied for 6 hours straight, managed to fracture it enough to pry it loose. Beneath that plate was something that should not have existed. A heart, but not in any sense that biology would define. It was not a muscle. It was not round. It did not pulse in rhythm with any living thing known to man. It was shaped like a honeycomb, a perfect hexagonal structure built from soft, amber-colored tissue. But each hexagon was alive. Each one pulsed independently, some fast, others slow, some even reversing direction, like they were pumping something both in and out at the same time. The entire structure shimmered, as if light passed through it differently depending on the angle. It did not pump blood. It did not connect to arteries. Instead, from each hexagonal cell, fine translucent tubes stretched outward, thousands of them, each branching into networks that fed into the surrounding tissue like mycelium threading through soil. Dr. Leung, the Pentagon's lead biophysicist, stared at the thing for a long time before saying what everyone else was thinking. It's not an organ. It's a city. And the more they studied it, the more that description seemed to fit. The cells communicated with each other. That much became clear after they introduced a tracer dye. When one cell pulsed, the dye flowed in a spiral pattern, triggering a ripple in neighboring cells, like a stone dropped into a pond surrounded by other ponds. The reaction was not random. It was patterned, coded, rhythmic, like a language, a hum without sound. Then came the real discovery. During a midnight test, one technician leaned too close to the heart while wearing a watch with an open mechanical back. The hands stopped. But not just stopped, they froze at an angle that mirrored the hexagonal grid beneath the surface. When the watch was removed, it ticked again. But its time was off by 7 hours, 23 minutes, and 18 seconds. Every time they tested a different watch, the same offset occurred. They called it the echo delta. No theory explained it, but one classified paper posited that the hexagonal heart was not measuring time but rewriting it. Each pulse, each cell, was a node in some higher dimensional mechanism, not life support, navigation. A biological compass for something that traveled not across space, but across sequence. Whatever this thing had been, it hadn't lived the way we do. It hadn't moved the way we move. Its body didn't age. It updated. Late one night, a junior researcher placed a tuning fork on the edge of the heart's casing. The fork vibrated for 17 seconds. Then, silence. Then, from inside the heart, a pulse. 1, then 2, then 3, and then, impossibly, a fourth pulse echoed through the lab, long after the tuning fork had gone still. No one touched the heart after that, not because it was dangerous, because someone or something had answered. The X-rays were the first sign something was wrong. There were no signs of marrow, no trabecular patterning, no density fluctuations you'd expect in living vertebrate tissue. Instead, the bones glowed faintly, like something mineral, something keyline fired. Dr. Halberd tapped one with a metal probe and recoiled at the sound it rang. Not a dull thud like human bone, but a clear, bell-like tone. Hollow, cold, resonant. Samples taken from the femur revealed a shocking composition, nearly 70% silicon, fused with trace elements not naturally occurring in Earth's biosphere. There was almost no calcium, no phosphorus, nothing even remotely organic. The bone didn't decay. It didn't rot. It refused to die. When the first break occurred during transport, the team expected dust, fracture, debris. Instead, the clean break was smooth as porcelain, with an inner surface that glinted like polished stone. But the real shock came later when someone dropped a halogen work light and the shattered bulb's heat washed over the broken limb. It started knitting back together. No blood, no cellular regeneration. Just a slow, silent fusion, like cracks in a ceramic mug closing under a kiln's breath. The seam disappeared completely in less than 6 minutes. The observers stood frozen. One whispered, "It heals like pottery." Another replied, "No, it remembers how it was made." The Pentagon's materials division began running thermal tests. Controlled heat at specific wavelengths revealed that the bones responded not just to temperature, but to intention. Pressure patterns made no difference. But when researchers focused on the break, visualizing it whole, picturing the bone unbroken, the structure responded faster. A thought, paired with heat, sped up the repair. A skeptical physicist ran the same trial with no visualization. The bone remained cracked. He tried again with the image of a complete limb in his mind. The fracture sealed. They began to wonder whether the material was truly solid at all, or, if it existed somewhere between matter and memory, something imprinted with a shape and destined to hold it. Not because of biology, but because it had been designed to do so. Late one night, a structural engineer brought in a porcelain teacup from her childhood. It had broken years ago. She placed it beside a sample fragment of the alien rib. The moment the bone warmed under the lab's light array, the cup trembled. It didn't fuse. It didn't move. But it hummed just faintly, as if echoing recognition. The bones were no longer viewed as mere structure. They were code, etched, not grown. And yet, they behaved with more intuition than anything synthetic. One handwritten note, found tucked behind a classified drawer, read, "If this was made, then who was the potter? And what fire did they use to bake something that cannot die?" The file was marked with a single code name, living porcelain. And from that moment on, the Pentagon's medical division stopped calling it a skeleton. They began calling it the vessel. The second body was different from the first in every possible way. Where the first had organs, structures, strange systems that mirrored biology as we knew it. This one had none. No heart, no lungs, no digestive tract. Just an empty chest cavity, smooth and polished on the inside, like the hollow of a bell. It was almost as if something had scooped out the torso from the inside, leaving a perfect shell behind. And yet, according to witnesses from the recovery site, this being had moved. It had walked. Its limbs had flexed. Its head had tilted toward the blinking lights of a rescue team's equipment. For several minutes, it had stood upright, breathing nothing, bleeding nothing until its body simply stopped, not collapsed, just stopped, mid-stride, as if the signal had been cut. As if the idea of motion had been withdrawn. The autopsy team assumed error, a misreading. Surely the organs were simply hidden deeper, structured differently. But no scans, no cutting, no probing revealed anything more than that yawning hollow beneath the breastplate. The chest wasn't damaged. It was deliberate. The interior was lined with a pale, iridescent membrane that responded to touch by tightening slightly, like a drumhead tuning itself. At the center of the hollow, faint markings were found. Not symbols, not writing, more like ridges in clay, a spiral pattern embedded in the surface, invisible until lit from the side. When a technician traced it with a gloved finger, a low pulse sounded beneath the floor. Not loud, but it was enough to make every monitor in the room blink once and then reset. The Pentagon brought in top-level biomechanics experts, and they too were baffled. Without organs, where did energy come from? How did it process motion, intent, decision? The spinal column was intact. Nerve bundles or something like them were present, but they fed into nothing. They ended in air. One military surgeon finally said what none of them wanted to admit. This thing wasn't alive in the way we understand it. They theorized it could have been remotely operated, a kind of biological drone. But the structure was too refined, too self-contained. There were no access ports, no receivers, no circuitry. And then came the anomaly. A new test, performed with a mist of nanoparticle tracers to map airflows inside the cavity, showed something chilling. When the body was exposed to direct infrared light, the particles began to spin. Not outward, like heat dispersing, inward, as if the chest was inhaling. Not air, not matter, but something. The team ran thermal imaging. The empty chest was colder than the surrounding tissue. Colder than the room, colder than ice. One physicist whispered a phrase usually reserved for black holes. It's not empty. It's negative. One classified report, buried deep in the Joint Intelligence Filing System, concluded with a single observation. This structure behaves like a housing unit, not for organs, for presence, a containment, or a vessel. One intern, later dismissed for reasons not made public, wrote in a forgotten margin, "What if its organs weren't removed? What if they never needed any?" She never finished the thought. But years later, when reviewing the footage of the body lying motionless on the slab, a technician paused the tape. For a single frame, just one, the chest bulged, then went still again. They wouldn't have noticed the markings at all if it hadn't been for a calibration test. A new scanning array had been installed in the lab, experimental tech developed for reading microfractures in aerospace materials. As a joke, one of the engineers ran it over the alien femur, expecting a smooth readout. What came back was something else entirely. Symbols. Tiny, intricate, razor-thin glyphs spiraling along the inner surface of the bone like circuitry carved by a jeweler's needle. They weren't scratches. They weren't natural. They were too deliberate. Perfect spacing, repeating intervals, each mark sharp and deep, almost burned into the structure. When the same scan was applied to the skull, even more appeared layered rings of script that curved around the base like a crown, radiating inward toward what should have been the seat of thought. The markings were invisible to the naked eye. No microscope revealed them. Only the particle scanner could see them, as if the symbols existed one layer beneath reality, Some were geometric squares nested in triangles, spirals with edges. Others looked like language, but not one from any human culture. Linguists tried mapping the patterns. Nothing matched. No ancient dialect. No modern cipher. No mathematics they could decode. Some experts thought it was a dead language. Others said it was code. The debate didn't last long, because then came the test that changed everything. A small bone fragment was isolated and subjected to frequency vibrations, part of a routine resonance study. At a specific frequency, around 40 kilohertz, the fragment began to hum. Not from stress, not from damage. It sang. The symbols glowed under the scan briefly, faintly, and the entire lab's power grid flickered. Nothing failed, nothing surged, but for a full 6 seconds, every digital clock in the facility counted backward. No one laughed after that. A physicist suggested the etchings could be command lines, biological instructions embedded at a quantum level, written not with ink or thought, but with pressure and light. Others theorized the symbols were meant to interact with space-time, not with tools, a kind of bone-deep password, a signature left by something ancient and exacting. One classified memo from the Pentagon's cryptographic division used the phrase, bio-encrypted memory. But memory of what? A retired signal analyst, brought in for consultation, stared at the scans for over 3 hours before speaking. All he said was, "I've seen this pattern before, not the symbols but the rhythm." He then refused to elaborate and left the facility the next morning. He never returned. His government file was sealed under emergency classification. Later, while reviewing high-resolution models of the femur's inner ring, a researcher spotted something that froze her in place. A set of repeating marks, 12 of them, almost like timestamps or coordinates, not on Earth. The final report was brief. One sentence: "If these are instructions, we have already failed to follow them." The symbols remain, untouched and untranslated, locked in a vault deeper than even the bodies themselves. Not because they are dangerous, but because some believe they were never meant to be read, only activated. At first glance, the digestive tract appeared almost vestigial. It was no more than 6 inches long, coiled like a nautilus shell, with walls that shimmered faintly under ultraviolet light. There was no stomach acid, no intestinal folds, no enzymes. Just that spiraled chamber and the strange, silvery dust packed inside it. Dr. Wren, who led the internal analysis, I said it reminded her less of a digestive organ and more of a wind tunnel, something that channeled, redirected, or filtered. But filtered what, exactly, remained a mystery. Samples of the dust were taken carefully and examined under dozens of microscopes. It wasn't sand, it wasn't mineral, it wasn't even organic. Each grain was a perfect sphere, impossibly smooth, but faintly magnetized. When a probe moved through the sample, the dust swirled into perfect rings and ridges, as though responding to some invisible architecture. But then came the moment no one could explain. During an overnight test, a junior tech forgot to shut the blackout shutters in the lab. At exactly 3:17 in the morning, a beam of moonlight slipped through the eastern window and struck the dish of collected dust. The dust began to glow not brightly, but with a cool, shifting shimmer like distant starlight seen underwater. And then, it moved. The particles rearranged themselves. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Spirals, then lines, then what could only be described as constellations. Tiny patterns resembling the Orion Belt, the Pleiades, and others no one recognized. One researcher gasped out loud as the shapes began rotating in sync, forming a 3-dimensional display that hovered just above the dish for several seconds before dissolving back into stillness. When the shutters were closed, the dust froze again. All attempts to recreate the phenomenon under artificial moonlight failed. Only natural lunar reflection triggered the change. The team theorized the spiral-shaped gut acted as a storage vault, not for waste, but for data, directional data. Navigational memory encoded not in software or star charts, but in particles responsive to celestial light. One classified document referred to it as a cartographic stomach. The idea was absurd, and yet undeniable. One researcher proposed that the being consumed these particles intentionally gathered from deep space, collected, like we might gather coordinates or maps. Each grain, a compass. Each swirl a memory of where the being had been or where it was trying to return. But if that were true, it raised a question none of them wanted to ask. Why was it here? In a forgotten note buried at the back of the folder, Dr. Wren scribbled something late at night, perhaps meant only for herself. What if this wasn't a digestive system at all? What if it was a homing device? The dust is now stored in a vacuum-sealed containment locker beneath level 43. Exposure is strictly forbidden during lunar events. Not for safety, but because, on clear nights, it begins to shift again, and it always points in the same direction, up. They thought it was a jaw misalignment at first. The creature's mouth was narrow, with no tongue, and the outer teeth flat, glassy, and perfectly spaced, didn't seem suited for chewing. It didn't make sense. But then the scans picked up something strange. There was a void behind the mandible, a spherical cavity that didn't show up on any initial dissection. It was hidden beneath layers of elastic cartilage, almost like a curtain drawn over a stage. The second mouth was not like the first. There were no lips, no gums, just a circular opening, ringed with tiny retractable teeth that glistened like polished obsidian. They were needle-thin, arranged in concentric circles that spiraled inward like the throat of a lamprey. Except these didn't just pierce. They spun. When researchers applied gentle pressure to the outer jaw, the inner cavity expanded slightly. The teeth flexed open, shimmered, then snapped back shut. One technician, watching the motion on slow playback, compared it to the iris of a camera lens. But it wasn't capturing light. It was waiting. Samples of the tissue around the second mouth revealed an odd blend of muscular and mechanical properties. There were microstrands of metallic fiber woven into the muscle fibers that contracted when exposed to electric signals, but also reacted to changes in magnetic fields. It wasn't just organic. It was engineered. That's when the deep-sea comparisons started to roll in. Marine biologists were brought in to consult, and they immediately recognized the design. This was predatory, not for speaking, not for eating, for gripping, for drilling. The inner maw wasn't passive. It was a mechanism, a tool. But the question was, for what? A theory emerged, one that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. The outer mouth was a decoy, a mask. It was there to disarm, to mimic humanoid form. The real function, the true interface, was deeper, more dangerous. Some speculated it wasn't even for consuming matter. One biophysicist posited that the second mouth might be used for sound-compressing vibrations through the spiral of teeth to create directional pulses, like a biological sonar weapon. Another whispered that it reminded him of data ports on pre-digital satellites. A test was arranged. A low-frequency vibration was directed into the cavity while the mouth was partially opened. The teeth did not resonate. They turned, slowly, silently. And for 6 seconds, the metal fixtures in the lab began to shake. The test was shut down. The incident was buried. Later, when a classified image from the autopsy was leaked to an archivist at Langley, the photo was shown to a retired Navy sonar technician. The technician paled and asked only one question. "Where did you find one of those?" No answer was given. In a handwritten annotation found at the bottom of a restricted file, someone had scrawled a short note. It was unsigned. The mouth is not for speech. The teeth are not for feeding. The second cavity is a device. We just don't know what it's waiting to receive. And beneath that, written in red, "Do not speak into it again." They removed the skin samples under sterile conditions, carefully sealing each sliver in vacuum-locked containment cells. At first, nothing happened. The outer dermal layer was smooth, unnaturally pale, and cool to the touch, closer in texture to soft silicone than flesh. It didn't flake, it didn't bruise, it didn't rot. Then, 3 days later, the first piece moved. Not far, just a twitch, a slow curling at the edges, like a leaf shrinking from heat. But the chamber was temperature controlled. There was no heat, no airflow, no stimulation of any kind. Yet when viewed under magnification, the cells within the graft weren't decaying. They were aligning, pulling toward each other, like iron shavings drawn to a magnet. A Pentagon researcher logged it as molecular cohesion anomaly. Another, less formal, gave it a different name, sleeper skin, because by the end of the week, the sample had nearly doubled in thickness. Not from swelling, not from infection. It was growing back. Tissue that had been sliced cleanly into flat rectangles began reshaping themselves into curves. Faint ridges appeared. Veins, or something like veins, re-emerged beneath the surface, pulsing faintly every few minutes with no source of blood or energy. The growth wasn't random, it had memory, a blueprint, like it remembered the shape of the body it once covered and was slowly trying to return. When one technician accidentally exposed a sample to bright light, the tissue recoiled violently, folding in on itself like a sea anemone touched by a predator. Later that night, the same piece extended again, smooth and flat as if nothing had happened. It had adapted. The Pentagon issued new protocols: never expose the samples to light, vibration, or heat. Never remove more than one at a time. And never, under any condition, touch the grafts with bare skin. That last rule came too late. A junior scientist, working past midnight, had fallen asleep at her station. Her glove was loose. When she stirred awake, the sample was gone. In its place, clinging just above her wrist, was a faint patch of new skin, paler, smoother, and visibly pulsing. She was sedated. The tissue was surgically removed. It screamed, not audibly. But every instrument in the room, scales, thermometers, oscilloscopes, spiked into chaos for 8 full seconds before returning to normal. The skin was locked away in an isolation vault beneath sublevel 18. But even there, in sealed darkness, it continued to grow, slowly, relentlessly. Each week, it absorbed whatever material surrounded it, cotton, plastic, synthetic rubber, and turned it into itself. One report claimed the graft had developed a faint sheen resembling scales. Another mentioned fingerprints, not random ones, duplicates of the original alien's palm. Later, in a restricted file labeled Project Hades, a biologist posed a single terrifying hypothesis. If this tissue retains not just structure but purpose, then it may also retain identity. In simpler terms, the skin might remember who it belonged to, and worse, it might be trying to go back. When the dissection team reached the limbs, they expected muscle, tendon, and connective tissue. What they found instead were tight clusters of transparent nodules embedded deep within the muscle, perfectly symmetrical, no larger than grains of rice, and cold to the touch. They were not bone, they were not cartilage, they were crystalline. And unlike anything that belonged in a biological organism. At first, the researchers assumed they were some kind of growth, perhaps internal sensors, calcified waste, or fragments of shattered implants. But then the crystals began to resonate. During a routine scan using low-level electrical pulses, one of the nodules emitted a faint sound, not static, not distortion, a tone, clear, clean, and musical. It lasted less than 2 seconds, then faded into silence. Curious, the team increased the pulse slightly. More crystals lit up, not with light, but with sound, each one producing a different pitch, layered like notes on an alien instrument. Within minutes, they had assembled a network of tones that, when played together, formed patterns, rhythms, cadences. Not random noise. It was music, but not music meant for ears. Some pulses produced single sustained notes, others brief chirps or rhythmic pulses. One array, located along what would have been the forearm, played a repeating loop of 12 descending tones that cycled every 13 seconds without variation. It sounded like a song, or a message, or perhaps both. One cryptographer brought in to analyze the patterns likened it to a sailor's shanty, a signal meant to be repeated and recognized. Another suggested it wasn't music at all but location data, a series of spatial reference points, encoded in harmonic frequency, a sonic map. Whatever it was old. One of the oldest researchers, a former signal analyst from the Cold War, said he'd heard something like it once before coming through deep-sea hydrophones off the coast of Antarctica in the early 1960s. At the time, it had been dismissed as tectonic vibration. He was no longer so sure. In one experiment, the team exposed the crystals to modulated electromagnetic fields. The results were immediate. The tones changed pitch, speed, and even direction. Some sounds seemed to twist, like they were wrapping around the room. It wasn't just audio. It was spatial. Later, using an advanced sonographic imager, a linguist mapped the frequencies into three-dimensional form. What emerged was breathtaking, a geometric lattice of sound, suspended in the air, like a blueprint made of vibration. She called it a cathedral of signal. One theory suggested the crystals were embedded instruments, tools for broadcasting or receiving, across vast distances, using harmonics instead of radio waves. Another proposed they were part of a biological chorus, a way for the species to communicate in layered frequencies beyond human hearing. But a third, more unsettling idea took root, that the crystals were beacons, not for sound, not for art, but for retrieval. In a restricted document marked Echo Array 9, a single annotation was underlined in red. Do not activate complete sequence. Playback may initiate response. And below that, almost too faint to read, what we thought was song may have always been signal, and signals get heard. They didn't notice it at first. The scans showed strange density near the chest, but the tissue in that area had already proven unorthodox, honeycombed instead of vascular, mineral instead of muscular. Still, the readings were odd. Not just dense, but pulsing. Not with a heartbeat. Something slower. Something deliberate. When they opened the cavity, it was empty, at least at a glance. No lungs. No heart. No typical organs. Just a hollow, dark chamber wrapped in layers of silken tissue. But beneath that layer, folded beneath something like a membrane, was another shape. Smaller. Different. It looked like a fetus at first, but it wasn't. The proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long, the skull too narrow, and the body wasn't connected to the host by any umbilical structures or blood vessels. It had been placed there, curled up in perfect stillness, like a passenger inside a hidden compartment. Some wanted to call it a parasite, others called it a stowaway, but the Pentagon file labeled it plainly as second entity, unknown. Its eyes were closed. Its skin was darker, with a matte gray tone that absorbed the light around it. It had no mouth, no visible openings of any kind. But under thermal imaging, its core temperature remained several degrees higher than the surrounding tissue, despite being removed from the host. In other words, it wasn't dead. It was dormant. Over the next 48 hours, the entity showed no movement. But strange anomalies began appearing in the lab. Static interference disrupted the heart monitors. Surgeons complained of migraines, nosebleeds, and auditory hallucinations. One guard outside the chamber reported hearing breathing from inside the sealed vault, even though no air system ran through it. The team attempted to extract a tissue sample from the second being, but the scalpel never made contact. The moment the blade touched the skin, it bent. Not snapped. Bent. Like it had met a surface too soft to cut, but too firm to penetrate. Later, under electron microscopy, the surface revealed millions of overlapping microscales, each thinner than a strand of hair, and capable of shifting orientation in response to light. The creature was armored, camouflaged, designed not to fight, but to hide. Which raised the most disturbing question of all. Was it placed inside the host, as cargo, as protection, or as a backup? Theories clashed. One group suggested it was a larval form, an offspring awaiting the death of the carrier to awaken and continue its function. Others believed it was the true operator, and the larger body was nothing more than a shell, an avatar for its hidden pilot. But one man, a retired biological warfare analyst, offered another idea. He said it reminded him of Cold War sleeper agents, hidden, silent, embedded deep behind enemy lines, waiting for a signal. He pointed at the sealed vault where the second entity lay. Then he asked the room one question. What if the host was never the visitor? What if that was? And on the fifth day, at exactly 0300 hours, the entity's eyes opened, not slowly, not sleepily, all at once, fully alert, fully aware. And then, it smiled, even though it had no mouth. The face was smooth, too smooth. No nostrils, no septum, just a faint ridge where a human nose would be. At first glance, the absence seemed like a deformity, maybe damage from impact or decomposition. But under the skin, hidden deep inside the neck, they found something else. A spiral chamber, coiled, organic, alive. It wasn't a nose. It wasn't lungs. It was something else entirely. A respiratory system folded into itself, concealed from the outside, like a snake coiled in a jar. The tissue was flexible but tough, lined with a mucous membrane that filtered air with unnatural efficiency. The spirals vibrated when exposed to oxygen, creating a faint whirring hum barely audible, like a machine idling far away. The biologist on site called it an internal rebreather, not mechanical. Entirely biological, yet built with the precision of engineered design. Tests showed the organ could process air with extremely low oxygen content. In some simulations, it filtered sulfur-rich environments without stress. In others, it tolerated extreme humidity and even airborne particulates that would have shredded human lungs. It didn't just inhale, it adapted. The structure was lined with microvalves that opened and closed in rhythmic patterns, not like breathing, more like modulation. It tuned itself, adjusting to environmental input in real time. The Pentagon's environmental team called it self-calibrating respiration. And then came the deeper scans. The rebreather wasn't just for filtering, it recycled. Internal loops captured expelled gases and reprocessed them, extracting trace elements, breaking down waste into reusable compounds, and looping it back into the bloodstream. Nothing was wasted. Every molecule was repurposed. One analyst likened it to a closed ecosystem in the throat, an entire atmosphere in miniature. But the strangest finding came when they introduced foreign gases into the sample chamber. Helium, argon, methane. The organ didn't react in pain. It thrived. Its vibration frequency shifted, its folds expanded, and its pulse stabilized. It could not only survive in alien environments, it preferred them. This wasn't an organ meant for Earth. It wasn't designed to breathe our air. It was meant to infiltrate. There were no filters to remove toxins because it didn't fear them. There were no nostrils to clog, no open passages vulnerable to infection. The entire system was internal, self-cleaning, shielded from any exposure. It was the perfect tool for a species that moved from world to world, the perfect organ for something that never wanted to be detected. A Pentagon document labeled the discovery as biological stealth adaptation, but a retired Navy deep-sea diver, brought in to consult, had another name for it: combat respiration. Because this wasn't built for peace. It was meant for survival. Hostile, quiet, long-term survival in environments that kill. One chilling note was added to the file months later, when a separate alien body recovered from a different crash revealed the exact same rebreather, identical down to the spiral count and tissue density. That crash had taken place nearly 4,000 miles away and over 10 years earlier, which meant the design hadn't evolved. It had been replicated, repeated, mass-produced, like part of a uniform, and uniforms belong to armies. At first, it looked like the ribcage had been shattered. The bones didn't spread outward like human ribs. Instead, they folded inward, sealed tightly at the center like clasped fingers. No breaks, no hinges, just a smooth fusion point where bone met bone with unnatural precision. It was more like a vault than a chest. No amount of pressure, cutting, or prying could force the ribcage open. Scalpels snapped, oscillating saws skated across the surface. Even laser tools failed to penetrate the bone. Its density was off the charts, like compressed obsidian laced with trace elements unknown to Earth's periodic table. That's when one researcher tried something different. Sound. Using a harmonic stimulator left over from a sonic metallurgy experiment, they played a sequence of low-frequency pulses against the rib structure. On the 7th frequency, somewhere between human speech and seismic, echo, the bones responded. They didn't crack. They shifted. The ribs unfolded, silently, methodically, like petals of a steel flower opening in time with an invisible rhythm. The movement wasn't mechanical, but coordinated, as if the bones had been waiting for the correct command, like a locked chamber responding to a passcode. What lay inside was not lungs, not muscle, not organs. It was a single, suspended sphere, no larger than a plum, glowing faintly with soft blue-white light. It floated in the middle of the cavity, anchored by thin filaments to each rib, not electrical wires, not veins. Something in between. Organic scaffolding with the tension of piano wire. The node pulsed gently, its glow in sync with the rhythm of the room. The longer they watched, the more its frequency began to mimic theirs: heartbeat, breath, even brainwave patterns. It wasn't just emitting. It was listening. Analysis began immediately. The Pentagon classified the node as non-terrestrial biointerface unit, but within the lab, it was simply called the Heartlight. When they moved a researcher within 1 meter of the sphere, their pulse rate accelerated, not from fear. The Heartlight mirrored their biological rhythms. The closer you got, the more it synced. It was an echo, a biological mimic. But why? Theories flooded the room. Some said it was a translator, an interface designed to mirror physiology for communication. Others believed it was a biological hard drive storing memory, emotion, or identity in vibrational patterns. But one theory silenced the room. A physicist from Langley whispered, "It's a beacon." He explained that the node operated on harmonics, consistent with gravitational wave fluctuations, ripples that traveled not through air, but through space itself, meaning it could send signals across light years with no delay, not a voice, not a cry, a location. And then came the disturbing part. When they removed the node from the ribcage, it dimmed, but it didn't die. It pinged, a single pulse. So low it wasn't heard, only felt, like the toll of a bell underwater. They captured it on every sensor in the facility. Accelerometers shook, compass needles wavered. For 2 full seconds, something in the room shifted, not physically, but spatially. One technician described it as the air folding in on itself. The node had broadcasted, but not in language, in presence. And whatever was listening had heard it. It was the left eye, glossy, motionless, slightly larger than the right. During the initial examination, No one noticed anything unusual beyond the eerie stillness. It didn't blink. It didn't retract when touched. It didn't soften under pressure. But it also didn't rupture. It refused to rupture. A week into the dissection, under magnification, someone noticed the telltale signs, perfect concentric rings buried beneath the iris, as if carved with microscopic precision. Not cellular, not organic, optical, mechanical. The Pentagon team halted everything. The eye was no longer classified as biological. It was designated synthetic ocular interface. They called in a contractor from a satellite optics firm. He examined the structure, then walked out of the room without a word. When asked later what he saw, he said, "That's not a camera. That's a telescope wearing a disguise." Surgical extraction took place 2 nights later. They didn't cut so much as unscrew it. The eye rotated in place 3 soft clicks, each one accompanied by a static burst across the room's monitors. Then it slid free with a wet hiss, trailing a coil of braided fiber no thicker than a hair. The room dimmed. The moment the coil disconnected, the lights above buzzed and flickered. Not power loss. Interference. Then the eye pulsed, not with light, but with movement. On the nearby wall, a flicker of imagery began to shimmer too faint for the naked eye, but visible through infrared sensors. Researchers scrambled for projectors, amplifiers, anything that could translate the signal into something human eyes could interpret, and it worked. Projected across the far wall, in slow looping flickers, were images that made no sense. Landscapes, but not of Earth. Massive vertical cliffs that reached into purple skies, rivers of light flowing through black glass canyons. A forest, but the trees were crystalline and hummed like tuning forks. No signs of life, only environment. But every frame pulsed with color and sound outside normal human range. One biotechnician noticed something odd. Each new image followed a consistent rhythm, like a heartbeat. Not random, not recorded. Real time. They weren't watching a memory. They were seeing a transmission. But where was it coming from? Or worse, where was it going? Another test confirmed what no one wanted to admit. The eye continued to function even when submerged, frozen, shielded, and locked in a Faraday cage. It didn't matter. It kept transmitting. Eventually, the Pentagon placed it in isolation. But even in deep storage, staff reported hallucinations when near the vault, flashes of alien skies, the sensation of falling upward, the sharp taste of metal in their mouths. One technician collapsed after claiming he saw the buildings breathing. The official file calls it Project Suncatcher. Unofficially, they call it the eye that waits, because the flickering hasn't stopped, and sometimes it blinks. They had opened skulls before, dozens of them. The anatomy varied, but patterns eventually emerged predictable in their alien strangeness, until this one. When they lifted the cranial plate, they found not just a brain, but something else. It moved before they touched it. Threaded across the folds of gray matter was a network of pulsing filaments, veiny, webbed, and unmistakably alive. It wasn't brain tissue. It wasn't vascular. It was fungal, a living fungus, latticed across the cerebral cortex like ivy claiming a building. It shimmered faintly under light, as if bioluminescent from within. When probed, it recoiled not like muscle, but like awareness. One assistant recoiled, whispering that it felt like it had looked back at him. Biologists were summoned. They confirmed it. Not a mold, not bacteria. True fungal cells, eukaryotic, self-regulating, yet somehow bonded to the brain at a molecular level. They weren't just coexisting. They were merged. One neurologist likened it to a coprocessor, an organic parasite enhancing, or maybe interpreting, the host's thoughts. But then the strange part. Parts of the brain shut down when the fungus was removed. The being didn't die, but it went silent. Brainwave activity dropped. As if something had been unplugged. The Pentagon listed it under a new classification, symbiotic cognitive relay organism, but others in the lab just called it the passenger. Tests continued. They isolated the fungus in nutrient gel, attempting to culture it separately. It didn't just grow. It wrote. Filaments began branching in geometric patterns across the surface of the dish, hexes, spirals, fractal curves, not random, structured. Each pattern repeated after a fixed time interval. When decoded against waveform analysis, the intervals matched solar flare cycles recorded by NASA telescopes in the 1970s. It wasn't just alive. It was timed, and still, it pulsed subtle rhythms that matched deep theta waves in human subjects nearby. Several researchers complained of strange dreams after long exposure. Others reported missing time gaps in memory that lasted minutes, sometimes hours. The strangest case came from a linguist assisting with waveform analysis. After reviewing the filament growth patterns for over 72 hours, she collapsed. When she woke up, she spoke in a language no one recognized. The recordings were sent to cryptographers. The structure matched no known human dialect, yet included recursive grammar loops, a form of self-refining syntax, artificial but emotional, linguistic but alien. Her episode was documented, but never explained. The fungus was later sealed in a vacuum containment jar and relocated to a black site outside Groom Lake. The last person to inspect it described something chilling in his final report. He wrote, "I do not think it is a parasite. I think it is a traveler. The body is not its host, it's its vehicle. And it remembers where it's going." There was no follow-up. The fungus was frozen in nitrogen and locked away. But on infrared scans taken weekly from the vault, one detail never changed. It still pulses. It began with a routine transfer. A vial of the clear, gelatinous substance extracted weeks earlier from one of the bodies preserved under freezing conditions and labeled plasma equivalent. Specimen 37. Technicians had handled this material countless times. It was strange, yes. Blood with no iron, no hemoglobin, and no cellular structure. But by then, the bizarre had become standard, until one of them spilled a drop. It struck the edge of a gloved hand and moved. Not dripped, not spread, moved. Like a creature tracing its own path. The technician froze, watching the translucent blob slide up the fabric toward his wrist with terrifying intent. A nearby researcher acted quickly, vacuuming the substance into containment. The glove was removed, burned, and documented. But later that night, something stranger happened. The recovered droplet, now sealed in a sterile tray, formed a thin filament that arched upward toward the glass. Slowly, with eerie precision, it pointed directly toward the technician. They tested again, this time with volunteers. Each subject placed a gloved finger near the substance. In almost every case, the gel reacted, but differently each time. It shifted shape. Sometimes it trembled, sometimes it recoiled. And in 2 cases, it formed branching tendrils that mirrored the subject's hand positions, like a shadow with memory. The conclusion was unsettling. It was not reacting to heat, or motion, or vibration. It was responding to DNA. Sequencing revealed something even more anomalous. Whenever the gel made brief contact with human tissue, even accidental brushings across a scalpel, it retained a signature. Days later, when placed near the same individual, it reacted faster, as if it remembered them. The Pentagon's bioresponse team filed it under a new term, hemoglyphic memory. Unofficially, the staff called it echo blood. Further experiments deepened the mystery. In one controlled test, drops of the gel were exposed to trace DNA from deceased researchers' scrapings from long-forgotten gloves, sealed years earlier. The blood still reacted. Tendrils formed and pointed slowly, subtly but unambiguously, toward empty chairs, dead file folders, discarded name tags, It remembered people who were gone. One researcher postulated the gel was not a circulatory fluid in the traditional sense. Instead, it might be a memory conductor designed not just to sustain the body, but to store encounters. Every touch, every wound, every interaction, a bloodstream that recorded the life it carried. Some began whispering the same theory behind locked doors. The blood wasn't just a fluid, it was an archive, a living record of everything the being had experienced, including us. The last documented test involved a classified scan using deep ultraviolet light. The substance flickered not with motion, but with images, shadows of human faces, fragments of places. A child's laugh warped through static, like a memory unfolding beneath water. The lights in the room surged. Several recorders failed, but the scan continued until the final flicker pulsed across the wall in total silence. It was a symbol, not language, not math, just a perfect spiral. Then the blood went still. No one speaks of the spiral now, but it still appears, drawn into fogged windows by those who touched it, etched into desks they never carved, remembered by something that should not remember us at all. They had opened dozens of bodies before this one, each stranger than the last. But when the surgeons peeled back the skin of specimen 69, they all stopped talking. For a moment, no one moved. The light in the room shifted almost imperceptibly, like the air itself had noticed. There were no nerves in the usual places, no tangled clusters, no branching chaos like in the human form. Instead, embedded just beneath the translucent tissue, was a network precise, symmetrical, and glowing. It pulsed faintly, like fireflies trapped in glass. Lines ran across the chest, along the limbs, up the neck, connecting every surface in mirrored balance. It was too perfect to be biological, but it was alive. At first, they assumed it was artificial, some form of internal tech, but scans showed organic conductivity. Each glowing line was a neural filament, not wired randomly like in mammals, but arranged with stunning intentionality. They called it the nerve map. The bioluminescence cycled in steady pulses 7 at a time, then pause, then repeat. No one could explain the interval, but someone later matched it to the rotation of a known pulsar in the Vela constellation. Coincidence, they said. But no one believed that. What stood out most was the design. From above, the nerves formed a pattern radiating outward like spokes from a center. When photographed under UV light and viewed at a distance, the symmetry became unmistakable. It resembled a navigational chart, a star map, not a metaphorical one, a literal one. Cross-referencing with astronomical data revealed a strange alignment. The nodal points in the nerve map corresponded roughly to known star positions, not from Earth's current perspective, but from somewhere else, somewhere far beyond the solar system. The curvature, the spatial distribution, it matched a vantage point deep in interstellar space. The implications were staggering. This being didn't just navigate the stars, it carried them inside. The Pentagon's neurobiology division flagged it immediately. They theorized the nervous system wasn't just for transmitting signals. It was an internal compass, a wayfinder, a built-in map not drawn in ink, but in flesh. One theorist proposed it was a memory of home. Another, more radical, and claimed it could be a form of communication, the entire nervous system structured as a language of starlight and distance. No consensus was reached. But then came the recordings. When electromagnetic pulses were sent through, the body, the nerve map, responded not just with brighter light, but with movement. The lines rearranged, just slightly, just enough, like a recalibrating system, or a response. Within seconds, the lights spelled a new configuration, another pattern, another map. A second researcher identified the new pattern. It matched the Alpha Centauri system shifted forward in time by several thousand years, using projected stellar drift. The body wasn't just remembering, it was plotting. A chart through space. Or through time. They terminated the test immediately. The body was resealed. Its casing locked, access revoked. But late that night, a final scan was run by an unnamed technician. No authorization, no log. Just one curious soul staring too long. The scan revealed one last change. The nerve map had rearranged itself again, into a spiral, perfect, endless, and pulsing. When they opened the back of specimen 71, the blades dulled instantly, not because of bone, not because of muscle, but because of something laced within the spine. At first glance, it looked like metal, but under the surgical lights, it refracted light strangely, as if absorbing part of the spectrum. What should have been silver gleamed with hints of violet and green. They paused the procedure, swapped in diamond-tipped scalpels, resumed. Beneath the tissue, running from the base of the skull all the way to the tailbone, was a segmented alloy threaded through the vertebrae like a second skeleton, not attached to the bones, fused with them, almost grown into the marrow. Metallurgists were brought in. Tests were inconclusive. It was metal, but not one found on Earth. High in density, impossible to melt with standard labs. It resisted acids, magnetic fields, even direct current. When exposed to heat, it didn't expand, it tightened, like it was responding with intent. Responding like a living wire. A Pentagon physicist gave it a name, conductor spine. The alloy responded to electric charge, not just passively, but actively. In one experiment, a low-voltage pulse caused the specimen's limbs to twitch 3 days after death. No muscle, no breath, just a spasm, and then another. When the current increased, the alloy emitted a soft hum. It wasn't noise, it was tone. Consistent, harmonic, and resonant with frequencies found in Earth's upper ionosphere. The kind of tone used in radio communications, except cleaner, more exact. It didn't just carry a signal, it was the signal. They theorized the being's spine was not only a structural support system, but a two-way device, a biological antenna, a translator, maybe even a transceiver. Its purpose, still unknown. But one fact stood out. The being was never meant to be alone. The metal didn't degrade. The tissue around it didn't reject it. If anything, it seemed optimized to grow alongside the alloy, suggesting coevolution, or perhaps manufacturing. When the autopsy team pushed a stronger signal through the alloy, one that mimicked Earth radar, the metal spine flickered. Not visibly. Not to the eye, but to the equipment nearby, it was unmistakable. A pulse. Precise, rhythmic. Like Morse code from a forgotten dialect, the message was intercepted by a technician's headset, just 3 tones, then silence. The tones were repeated hours later, again in the same pattern, even though the body had been removed. The signal didn't seem to originate from the specimen anymore. It came from outside, from somewhere far. Tracking it was impossible, but when they played back the tones, slowed them down by a factor of 10. A Pentagon linguist wept. It wasn't a message, it was a name, not human, not machine, a name spoken in metal, humming through a spinal cord never meant to die. They locked that room, sealed it shut, but no matter what they did, the hum returned every week. Same tone, same name, waiting for something or someone to answer. It was late. The chamber had been cleared. Most of the personnel had gone home, citing headaches, nausea, or strange dreams that made sleep impossible. Only a skeleton crew remained: a surgeon, a linguist, and a technician operating the old analog recording equipment. The air was cold, dry with recycled sterility. The body lay still on the table, scalp peeled back, skull partially exposed. There had been no vocal cords, no lungs, no mouth that could speak in any human sense. And yet, someone suggested sound. A final test, they said, a low-voltage electrode placed just near the base of the skull. Not in, just near. The lights dimmed, not flickered. Dimmed, like the room itself was holding its breath. And then, it began. Not a scream, not a voice. A tone. A single, long harmonic sound rising like wind through a canyon, but more delicate. Like something had been waiting, dormant, for the chance to be heard. The technician, who had served in war zones, dropped to his knees. Tears streamed down his cheeks, but he didn't know why. The linguist began sobbing so violently, her chair tipped backward. The surgeon, stoic, precise, cold, started whispering to someone who wasn't there. The sound was recorded. Once. Afterward, the reel became blank, not damaged, erased. There were no magnetic distortions, no dropouts, no failures in the tape. The information had simply vanished. They played the sound once more through the intercom system. This time, they invited 2 officers and a psychologist. Within 15 seconds, both officers had removed their earpieces. One vomited. The other muttered, "It remembers," over and over until sedated. The psychologist reported a different experience. He claimed he saw his mother, but not as she was in life, as she would have been had she never died, had she never gotten sick, had she never left. He wept without embarrassment and couldn't remember anything else. No one knew if the tone was language, music, or warning. A bioacoustics expert later proposed that it wasn't meant for ears at all, that it resonated with something older in the human brain, a pre-language pattern, a primal neural pathway, an echo so ancient that it bypassed words entirely. And then came the forgetting. Everyone who had heard the sound directly, after weeping, forgot. Names, places, conversations. For some, it was hours. For others, days. A few never recovered the memory at all, just gaps where time should have been. One technician left a note on his desk before quitting. Whatever it said, it didn't want to be remembered. Only felt. The Pentagon issued a formal memo. No further auditory exposure permitted, but the tone had already been heard. In dreams, in tinnitus rings. In moments of silence when the world gets too quiet. One whistleblower, now decades retired, described it best. It was like hearing the birth of your own death, and loving it, and letting it go. No one plays that tone anymore. Not because they can't, because they might remember what they forgot. They call it the Black Vault, though no one knows if that's the official term or something whispered into life by those who've been near it. It's not a room, not really. More like a sub-basement of a sub-basement, tucked beneath steel, concrete, and lead. The kind of place that doesn't show up on any blueprints. You don't just go to the Black Vault, you're summoned. And only if the cost of knowing outweighs the cost of never asking. Inside are no blinking lights, no futuristic interfaces, just boxes, reels, canisters, sealed drawers. Thick folders tied with twine and wax stamps, like they belong in a museum of horrors rather than a government facility. Every specimen retrieved, every autopsy logged, every film frame, blood sample, and shattered lens that recorded what should not be recorded buried there. A mausoleum of alien evidence too strange to destroy, too dangerous to release. There were only 7 who had access, clearance beyond top secret. Beyond even the old majestic levels whispered about in declassified redactions. These 7 didn't report to presidents. Presidents, in fact, were often not told at all. The first to disappear was a medical analyst. She had spent 4 days reviewing what came to be known as the crystalline lung. Her badge pinged the access panel at 0200 hours. She entered the vault. She never came out. Security footage cut to static for 13 minutes. When it returned, the door was closed. No trace. Not even her shoes. The second disappearance came 6 years later. A physicist. Brilliant. Reclusive. He'd been examining something recovered from what might have been a craft or an organ. No one could decide. He began sketching symbols, obsessively. Runes, spirals, geometric shapes that didn't follow Euclidean logic. One day, he left behind a single page that read, "The vault breathes," then silence. He was last seen walking into a fog-covered park in Arlington. Gone. No body. Just scorched grass where he stood. Then there was the one who went mad, an intelligence handler, decorated, disciplined, a man who prided himself on never flinching, even during interrogations that would leave others trembling. After reviewing an audio tape labeled Memory Pulse, he locked himself in a Pentagon restroom for 6 hours. When they finally broke the door, he was crouched in the corner, muttering about the shape beneath the skin. They committed him that night. He never spoke clearly again, just drew. Endless variations of a spiral folding inward, each one slightly different, like something was trying to perfect itself through him. The remaining 4 never speak of it. They don't gather, don't even acknowledge one another when they pass in the hallway. It's as if the vault leaves a residue not on the hands, but on the mind. A slow corrosion that rewrites perception one memory at a time. The vault is still there, buried and humming. Rumors persist that it expands on its own, that new drawers appear overnight, that items long removed return, and somewhere, deep in that dark, forgotten chamber, is a film reel labeled in trembling handwriting. The autopsy that dreamed back. But no one knows what it means. Or rather, they did. Before they went inside, they called it a crash because that's what made sense. Mangled metal, scorched earth, a thunderclap of fire streaking across the desert sky in 1947. But behind closed doors where names were never used and meetings had no paper trail, a different theory emerged. Not loud, not official, just a whisper, a suspicion that gnawed its way into the minds of those who looked too closely. The body wasn't accidentally left behind. It was placed. They began calling it the gift theory. Not because it was benevolent, no one truly believed that, but because it felt like something had been given, not lost. And the deeper the analysts dug into the biology, the technology, and the impossible contradictions inside that body, the more the idea began to root itself in their thoughts like a splinter too deep to pull out. There were no wounds consistent with an ejection or a crash, no burns, no fractures. The being had not been thrown from the craft. It had been lying down, perfectly aligned, arms folded, as if it had been laid to rest. Deliberately. Inside the lungs, if you could even call them lungs, there were trace gases not found in Earth's atmosphere. The last breath it took hadn't been from our world, and that breath had been clean, peaceful. Not panicked, not gasping, but chosen. Then came the internal timing anomalies. The being's cellular degradation, what little could be measured, suggested that it had been dead for days before the craft hit the ground. But that couldn't be, unless it had already been dead when the ship departed. Or worse, unless the craft wasn't meant to fly at all. What if it was a coffin? A delivery pod? A container meant to arrive? In 1963, a linguist embedded with the Pentagon proposed something that chilled the room. He said the body might be a form of communication, that the symbols etched into its bone, the bioluminescent nerves, the crystalline organ structures, they weren't random biology. They were a language, a message not in ink, but in anatomy, a message written in meat. Imagine, he said, if you wanted to send a message across time and space, and you knew machines might fail. But biology can adapt, evolve, be interpreted. A body is harder to erase than a letter. Some scoffed. Others didn't sleep that night, because if the body was a message, the question changed. It was no longer, what are they? It became, what are they trying to say? Years later, a team ran pattern analysis on the nerve structure again. One of the AI systems, recently developed, flagged a match. not to any language or code, but to a star chart. An arrangement of pulsars and gravitational waves mapped in luminous pathways across the spinal cord, as if the body had been sculpted by the same hands that charted the cosmos. And if it had been sent, who or what was the recipient? That's when the theory truly turned cold in the blood, because the answer might not be the Pentagon, or the military, or even humanity. The answer might be the Earth itself. Not a warning, not a gift, just a key. And we were never meant to open the door. In the spring of 1964, deep beneath the Nevada desert in a facility with no official name, something happened that was never meant to be recorded, but it was. Not on paper, not on film, not in anything you could lock in a drawer. It lived only in the trembling breath of a nurse who had no clearance to be there, only orders, and hands that shook too much after what she saw to ever hold a syringe again. The being had survived. Not long. 11 minutes. But in those 11 minutes, time warped into something unrecognizable. Medical staff called to the room didn't notice it at first. The entity had been assumed dead, its body unresponsive for nearly 2 hours. But then a flicker, just a twitch behind one eye. The crystalline lens shimmered, not with light, but with movement. It looked at them, not past them, at them. No words came from its mouth. There were no lungs, no vocal cords in the traditional sense. But the nurse, Anna Whitlock, 27 years old, Navy background, strong heart, steady mind, heard something inside her own skull. Not a voice, not even sound, a presence. She screamed, not out of fear, but something deeper, something cellular. Her body reacted before her brain could form meaning. And when the doctors reached her, she was collapsed on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Later, when she could speak again, all she said was, "It knew me." The audio recordings from that room picked up nothing, but the monitoring equipment registered electrical surges in the EEG devices nearby, patterns consistent with dream states, hallucinations, even seizures, yet no one had touched the machines. They were simply close to the being when it awoke. Those 11 minutes unfolded like a ripple in the fabric of logic. The creature did not move, but everyone in the room felt it pulling. Not physically, but emotionally. Some described the sensation as grief so pure it felt like drowning. Others said it was warmth, like they were being shown a memory from childhood. One man vomited and wept at the same time. A tech assistant bit through her own tongue and claimed, once conscious, that she had seen herself die on Mars. And then it stopped. The being exhaled not through its mouth, but through a series of pores that opened briefly across its chest. The vapor it released hung in the air like glass dust, catching the overhead lights and forming temporary symbols that no one could decipher before they faded. The heartbeat monitor went silent. Anna Whitlock never returned to the base. She was reassigned to a mental health facility in Maine, and for 22 years, she never spoke of that day. Until 1986, when she sent a letter to a journalist who had written a speculative piece on government secrets. The letter was never published. But the journalist kept it, and years later, under anonymous conditions, released it in fragments. In her own words, she wrote, "I didn't hear it speak, I remembered it, like I had always known what it would say. And what it said was, goodbye." To this day, no one knows what lived inside that body, or why only one of them ever woke, but for 11 minutes, it remembered us. And somehow, we remembered it. The first samples were sent to a lab that didn't officially exist, buried beneath a mountain facility with no doors that opened from the outside. They called it Project Nightform. The goal was simple: reverse engineer the tissue, turn the unknowable into blueprint, make flesh into weapon. They started with slivers, small, clean cuts of the strange, elastic membrane that passed for skin. At first glance, it was organic, but under intense scrutiny, it defied classification. It had cellular patterns, but no nucleus. protein strands, but no amino acid base native to any known Earth species. The structure was lattice-like, self-healing, and strangely cold even at room temperature. When exposed to human enzymes, it shriveled and turned black. Still, they pressed forward. Within months, the Pentagon had ordered several classified agencies to attempt biointegration trials. Their vision: apply the material to pilots make suits that could survive zero atmosphere and G-force collapse. Embedded into satellites, create self-repairing hulls. Some even whispered of using it on soldiers, grafting alien biology onto human hosts to create warriors immune to heat, cold, and vacuum. But the tissue rejected Earth's DNA. Every single attempt at splicing it with human genetic material triggered violent cellular implosions. In one instance, a live culture spontaneously burst into flame. In another, it liquefied under ultraviolet light, but only after displaying visible muscle twitches, even outside a host. One virologist swore he saw something like an eyelid blink across the petri dish. Efforts turned toward synthetics trying to replicate the substance molecule by molecule, but the structure was too complex. It was like trying to duplicate a cathedral with sand and paper clips. At one point, a team claimed partial success by bonding fragments of the tissue with deep-sea bacteria. They created a film that shimmered under X-rays and pulsed when exposed to specific tones. The film lasted 13 hours, then it simply vanished. Not degraded, not destroyed. Just gone. Years passed. Billions were spent. Promising leads would collapse into silence or madness. A cybernetic engineer who claimed to have cracked the language of the tissue was later found in the desert, naked and muttering binary strings while clawing at her skin. Her notes were sealed and never released. Eventually, the programs quieted down, not ended, just buried deeper. The failures were framed as classified dead ends, and those who had touched the project were reassigned, discharged, or disappeared altogether. But not all gave up. A former military biologist, now operating under a new identity, claimed in a posthumous recording that the tissue wasn't meant to be copied, that it had built-in fail-safes, genetic tripwires designed to prevent mimicry. She described it as language written in skin, and that Earth's biology simply lacked the alphabet to read it. She ended her message with a warning. Maybe it wasn't a body. Maybe it was a device. And maybe we weren't meant to open it. Her remains were never found. In the end, what they learned was less about the being and more about the limits of human hubris. The body had come to Earth, and humans had tried to fold it into their machines, their war plans, their ambitions. But the flesh did not belong here, and it knew it. The final file wasn't labeled with a number, just a symbol, 2 concentric circles, broken by a jagged line like a heartbeat flatlining. It arrived years after the others, transferred in silence from a base no one admitted still existed. Inside the metal case was a flash drive, a single audio log, a scan, and a handwritten note in smudged red ink: do not open unless ready to stop sleeping. The body in question had been badly damaged in the crash, limbs twisted, torso partially liquefied. But the stomach, if that's what it could be called, was strangely intact. It wasn't like a human stomach. No acid, no digestive enzymes. It was more like a containment chamber, lined with hexagonal mesh and soft fiber that pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves. What lay inside wasn't organic. It was a cube, roughly the size of a clenched fist, but not solid, not glass, not crystal, not metal. It shimmered like a frozen soap bubble trapped in mid-burst. Every angle refracted differently, and even in complete darkness, it glowed, faintly, almost like it was alive. The technicians who discovered it assumed it was some kind of energy capsule, maybe a power source, maybe a beacon. One of them called it the last meal of a dying god. When they attempted to open it, nothing happened. For 3 weeks, they tried everything: heat, cold, sonic pulses, magnetic fields. Nothing. Then, on the 22nd day, a junior analyst, one who had not touched the body, accidentally brushed it with his bare hand. The cube reacted instantly. It unfolded like origami in reverse, not with sound, but with pressure. Every person in the room described it later as a tightening in the chest, a ringing in the ears, a moment of being watched. Inside the cube was not emptiness. Some described it as a hologram, others as a memory, somehow compressed into space. What emerged was a sphere, rotating slowly, showing planetary systems unknown to Earth. Strange constellations, binary suns, blue stars that pulsed with unfamiliar rhythms. The images bled into the walls, into skin, into retina. One technician screamed and clawed at his own eyes, saying he could see too much. But then the image changed. A shape formed in the center, humanoid, but not. It hovered in midair, silent, arms outstretched. No eyes, no mouth, just presence. The room dropped in temperature, clocks stopped, recorders failed, and everyone inside heard a single word, not through ears, but through blood. Remember. That was all. The cube collapsed back into its original form and turned black. It never glowed again. The analysts who witnessed the event were debriefed separately. 2 were hospitalized. 1 vanished en route to a secure site. The remaining personnel were reassigned to unrelated positions, never permitted to speak of what they'd seen. The footage was sealed in the deepest chamber of the Pentagon's vault, one reportedly beneath even presidential clearance. And the cube? Some say it was buried. Others claim it was launched into space. One theory says it's still here, locked inside a Faraday cage in the Nevada desert, guarded not by soldiers, but by machines. But what no one could explain was why it had been inside the being. Not in its hand, not in a vessel, but inside it. Not eaten, not swallowed, stored, like a message, not for us, but for whoever would eventually cut it open.